In this second part of the screencast lecture on the Parol evidence rule, let's take a closer look at the principal cases you read. We begin with the common law Parol evidence rule. As you read, Mitchell against Lath refuses to enforce an alleged oral agreement to tear down an ice house on neighboring property. Despite some hedging about how to determine integration, the court ultimately applies the classic four corners test for integration. As you can see in paragraph 6 and paragraph 9, the majority opinion looks to the face of the agreement, within its four corners, to determine whether it's completely integrated. The decision formally rests on this traditional four corners analysis. But the majority also discusses, also in paragraph 6, the natural emission test and the broader context in which the parties made this real estate agreement. And the dissenting opinion suggests asking the hypothetical question of whether the parties would have included in the written contract the alleged agreement about the ice house if they'd made it. These are both precursors of the more permissive approach to integration that currently prevails under both the restatement and the UCC. Ironically, we find the clearest statement of the four corners test in paragraph 12 of the dissenting opinion. Speaking of irony, we'll discover something unexpected about each of our principal cases. The first irony concerns Mitchell against Lath. It appears from the dissenting opinion that the evidence of an oral agreement to tear down the ice house was quite convincing. As a result, the court's decision barred proof of an agreement that the parties almost certainly had made. We should ask ourselves what could justify a rule that frustrates the evident intent of the parties. Please pause the video now to jot down your answer to this question. The key to justifying such a rule is to ask yourself what incentives the Parol evidence rule creates. By excluding contextual evidence of this oral agreement, the rule creates an incentive for the parties to put any additional terms into their written agreement. As you can see, this approach privileges text over context. Judges who adopt this view undoubtedly believe that written agreements provide greater certainty about the parties' obligations. They worry that letting parole evidence override a written contract runs the risk of mistakenly enforcing terms to which the parties didn't agree. Being able to focus solely on the written terms also makes it much easier, and thus less costly, for courts and the parties to resolve disputes. But notice that in at least some cases, like Mitchell, this rule frustrates or ignores the apparent intent of the parties. Now consider Masterson against Sign. The court relies on parole evidence to enforce an alleged oral agreement that the repurchase right could only be exercised by Masterson himself. That's to say that, contrary to the usual default rule of assignability, the repurchase option here was non-assignable. Like the dissenting judge in Mitchell, the majority here emphatically rejects the four corners test. As a policy matter, Justice Traynor concludes that proof of an oral agreement should be admissible so long as the fact finder is not likely to be misled. As he explains, the credibility of the proffered evidence is the key. The opinion discusses both the restatement and UCC standards for integration. Under Restatement Section 216, we ask whether the additional term might naturally have been omitted. And under UCC Section 2202, Comment 3, the question is whether that term would certainly have been included in the writing. As you can see from the formulations of these tests, the UCC's permissive approach more readily allows proof of a parole agreement. But let's think for a moment about whether the parties in this case really had an agreement about assignability. The great irony in Masterson is that the alleged agreement was almost certainly never made or even considered by the parties. we can be sure that they would have agreed to make the right personal if they'd thought about the question. But there's no evidence at all that they did. Assignability was most likely far from their minds when they made the deal. The problem for Dallas Masterson is that the default contractual gap filler makes his repurchase right assignable. The court arguably uses the alleged Parol agreement to capture the parties' true desires on this issue. But it's also important to notice that the decision uses contextual evidence to enforce an agreement that almost certainly wasn't made. In this sense, we see that context triumphs over text. This is a strong trend in the development of both the common law and the UCC. Both take a more permissive approach than the traditional four corners test. One last word about Masterson. The dissent's somewhat overheated rhetoric about fraud is possibly correct. There's something potentially unseemly about allowing transactions that may shield assets from legitimate creditors. But it turns out that bankruptcy law is perfectly capable of dealing with fraudulent transfers of property by insolvent debtors. I'm far more sympathetic with the dissent's argument that courts should perhaps do more to protect the writing. To summarize briefly, the threshold issue under the Parol evidence rule is whether we have an integrated writing, and if so, whether it's fully or only partially integrated. By far the most common evidence of full or complete integration is a merger clause. The purpose of a merger clause is to exclude additional terms entirely. If the parties' agreement is only partially integrated, or not integrated at all, then a court will consider evidence of consistent additional terms. Thanks for listening.